The city is a woman, said the man on Forest Avenue. He was holding his brown bag of fortune, and his eyes were salt. Do you know she loves the body of a man, even though he's beat her? All this as the gulls rose up over the black chimney towers and the trucks stomped and rolled into the Eastern Market District. The heart of a city, this one, is full of coughing and dead radiators, and men whose time is a lottery. The women in it grow dark and mute and hum songs to hanging laundry that is never fully cleaned off. The children in it are leaving it. We must remember that the city is a woman, he said.
More than 90 children lived on Pearson between Santa Clara and Pickford Streets. There was never a shortage of fun. Kids played outside, often in Mary's home, from dawn until the streetlights came on. One late Sunday afternoon in July, the neighborhood children were playing in Mary's sprinkler when the parents called everyone inside. Mary's family watched the television in their family den. The riots looked similar to the nightly news coverage of the Vietnam War. But this wasn't Vietnam. It was Detroit. And the riots, although far from their home, had extended to Grand River Avenue. Outside their window, the sun was still shining, the birds chirping. Mary could see no flames. But Detroit was indeed burning.
We were living on Calvert during the riots. And as a child, I really didn't know what was happening. I just knew that it was very stressful and it was terrifying. We spent the evenings on the floor because of the snipers. We could hear gunshots in the distance. In the morning, when my dad would take out the garbage, there would be a soldier sitting behind the garage, dressed in uniform, full battle gear with all the equipment, grenades, M16, everything. Behind every garage was a soldier. This is how we lived during we considered it to be an occupation.
That same summer, one of Mary's father's stores was flooded, and thousands of dollars of inventory was destroyed. Mary's father was underinsured for damages. Insurance companies paid little to help Detroit businesses recover from the riots, and banks wouldn't provide flood recovery loans for the same reason. Neither insurance companies nor banks were interested in helping businesses recover in Detroit proper. Mary's family's financial situation changed, and so did the lifestyle. Gone were the housekeepers and handyman services. Mary's mother was ill-prepared to care for her children alone, so she relied on her older children to do so. But they were also young.
So I grew up in Detroit, and in my age range, you grow up in Detroit with a vivid sense of Detroit as both legacy and ruin. And so I grew up in the 70s in Detroit, which means that I grew up during busing, public school shift and change, and I grew up with a visceral sense of racism, that racism was a paramount topic, and it was on everybody's minds, and it was the anguish and the ache that defined the city for me as a male growing up in the city. And so that is one of the vivid experiences I have, and it was one of the experiences that I could not avoid writing about when I wrote about it, nor could I avoid writing about the city as a study in vanishing, and the city as a paradox, a contradiction, because it's also an heroic city. And so if you look at Detroit as a narrative and a reputation place, it has heroics in it and it has ruin in it. So that became a very focal point and continues to be a focal point for me when I write about it. And I would underscore that I write about it always with love. When we were kids, we would really feel the attunement and sensitivity to street lines that marked neighborhoods. And so if there was a new person standing on the street line, be it Grand River, be it Loss, or be it Evergreen, these thoroughfare streets, they would be assessed as intruders. There was not a homogeneous sensitivity in Detroit. It was actually not very, very well developed. And I don't really know why, but it wasn't. But because of that, it excited an agitation with people. And so people became perhaps preconsciously or subconsciously territorial. And because of that, you would have this kind of almost tribal sense of whose line you were standing on at the most exacerbated level, but of course it was white and black. And that legacy precedes me and you. That was a setup many, many years earlier when Detroit's flourish of production started to bring all kinds of immigrants in from the South, or folks coming in looking for work from the South. But the policies of containment for Afro-Americans also set up this horrid dynamic where there was isolationism rather than integration in the true spirit of that word. And so from that standpoint, I think we all grew up with the sense that it was us versus them. This whole business of white flight in suburbs and stuff, the suburbs were an enculturation of opportunity. And there's some glory in that the narrative was if you get your car and you get your money, you can move out. And we'll create this whole vast burbia where you can have a plot of land. You know, folks may not know, but Detroit in its earliest inceptions was a study in density. The crowding situation in the neighborhoods was extreme, and so I don't think it was necessarily pathological or wrong for the opportunists, the builders, to start to build outside of the main core of the city, but it again became its own stream of movement. And so this whole business of white flight that people who don't live here may not understand, that white flight was in part itself a reaction to the incipient danger of turbulence that was happening in the 60s. Now, clearly there was some of it that was based in simplistic bigotry, whites not liking blacks, whites being afraid of blacks, that whole narrative that the black man is unsafe and dangerous, which is hype. But it was really, 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 I think, fabricated. But a lot of it was also just the chaotic aftermath, plus the vivid opportunity to buy your land. So white flight is, I think it's a contribution of many different streams. And I don't know that it's even yet fully understood.
In my neighborhood growing up, there was incredible inequality. And it was between the people who lived in these houses and the people in the projects, which were the next block over, who went to my school with me. And I remember just pondering it, and I remember going to the house of a friend of mine who lived in the bricks, in the Parkside projects. And I said to her, how come you live here? It looked like, wow, a lot of people. I never had seen anything like, a big place where a whole bunch of people lived, because we lived in single, only blocks away. But it was a whole thing to me, like, wow, how come you live here? And the girl cried. And she was my friend in school, and her dad was a janitor at school. And my dad worked at Chrysler, and we had a nice house 2 blocks away. I had a completely different life. Than somebody 2 blocks away who was in my class with me every day.
devil came to Detroit and tore everybody down. I'm a lifelong Detroiter. I was born in 1953. My family came here from New Orleans, Louisiana to work at the auto factories like so many other people did during that period of time. As a matter of fact, members of my family had been coming here since 1944. So anyways, in 1951, my father, who was a musician, he'd been on the road with various bands playing jazz, blues, R&B since 1937. And he was on his way to a job in Cleveland from New Orleans. And he stopped here to see my uncle. He was living here and working at the Ford Rouge plant. And so my father stopped off here to see him, and my uncle started talking to him about getting off the road. You know, he'd been on the road for so many years, and he had 5 kids in New Orleans. Not to mention my mom was kind of on his case to get off the road too. So the next morning my father, went over to the Rouge plant, was hired on the spot. He didn't even make the gig in Cleveland. He had to send another bass player to Cleveland to play that job. So, but when I was a kid, I was living in Detroit. But when my parents said home, I always know they meant New Orleans.
Mary's father Joe's story began on Warren Street. Her dad was born in the upstairs of a modest flat at 984 Warren Street. When her engineer grandfather lost his manufacturing factory and home in the Depression, the family moved into a rented duplex at 3604 Garfield. This home had no bathing facility, neither shower nor functional bath or hot water. They heated water on a potbelly stove. The adjacent building had a yard piled with junk. His mother, Margaret, always kept their own home tidy, but one day his mother spotted a banana peel on a neighbor's curtainless window facing their dining room. She said nothing, burst into tears, and retreated into an empty bedroom. Margaret was known to be an immaculate housekeeper and didn't let the lack of hot running water be an excuse for anything less than personal cleanliness. She needed to give her children pride. She'd say, "Sure, we're poor, but nothing less than poor." Joe's recollection of a particular week, beginning on Friday, July 3rd, 1936, is very vivid. On July 4th, plagued by bedbugs and armed with a new popular insect spray, Bugaboo, his father, Frank, sent the family outdoors. Frank was determined to rid the house of bedbugs once and for all. He didn't have a mask on when he sprayed. When 2 days later Frank became ill and his condition gradually worsened, slurred speech on Wednesday, admitted to a public hospital early in the afternoon on Thursday, and dead by 11:30 p.m. that night, the 7 remaining kids were forbidden from touching the Bugaboo. Later, it was declared toxic and taken off the market. Joe played baseball to get him through bleak times. He had a saying, "Hang close and stay in the game. If so, you never know what can happen in the 9th inning." It was this kind of tenacity that got him through life. Joe played a lot of alley ball as a kid. Kids learned to bat balls within the confines of an alley. They'd assemble their own teams with a lot of autonomy. Life was good, and a good mitt would make it even better. When Joe was about 11, Kellogg's introduced an offer on their cereal box that seemed too good to be true. They offered a Pinky Higgins baseball glove for 100 box tops plus a quarter. Pinky Higgins was the Detroit Tigers' third baseman. Kellogg's Corn Flakes was their breakfast cereal of choice. It would still be an obstacle for Joe to save 100 box tops. The task seemed insurmountable. Joe's neighborhood friends were mostly Italian, and many of them started their day with coffee. His brother-in-laws worked at GM Diesel. They posted notes on the bulletin board. Somehow, by every means possible, Joe had the 100 box tops and the quarter. He mailed his collection to the Kellogg's company and waited. Joe envisioned a mitt comparable to the one Pinky Higgins used. Finally, the package arrived from Battle Creek, Michigan. He tore it open. There it was, a baseball glove, suited for a 4-year-old. There was no way to catch a single throw with it. He carried it to the alley and flung it in the garbage can. Sure, they were poor, but nothing less than poor. Gradually, the economic noose slackened. War broke out in Europe, and the factories reopened to supply the Allies with military equipment. Assembly lines were converted to mass production tanks, airplanes, and warships. Joe's siblings found work in these factories in Detroit. Wages increased. The family was able to move to a middle-class neighborhood on Detroit's west side on Monte Vista Street. The Garfield Street era was over. They now had a working shower and bathtubs, a washing machine, a gas cooking stove, a refrigerator, and a bike. They were sent to private high schools, and Joe attended the University of Detroit, where he earned a business degree in accounting. Joe started an accounting firm. He later married Joan, a nurse, and started a family. His business was successful, and he started another business in sporting goods retail. As a result, his children had the best leather mitts, the latest bats of all sizes and weights. He bought a large colonial home with a white fence on Detroit's northwest side, an acre lot in which his children played baseball in their front yard.
Hey, Shell, you doing all right?
I'm doing.
You heard about all this craziness been going on since last night?
I heard.
I grew up on Prairie between 6 Mile and 7 Mile. And so we always called my street Little House on the Prairie. And I write about Detroit. I'm a playwright and an actor, and I write about Detroit because I want to tell a different narrative about our city than the one that is commonly heard in the media. I think that Detroit gets a pretty bad rep, and every time people talk about Detroit, they talk about it in ways that it is disintegrating, in ways that I think create a negative psyche around the city. And that's not the city that I know. That's not the city I grew up in. That's not the city where I found the husband that I have right now, who's one of the greatest men I've ever known. It's not the narrative of my family. There's a reason why Detroiters are so proud of our city. There's a reason why we can leave and go anywhere else and find each other and flock to each other. And there's a reason why no matter what's happening in Detroit, we sort of become crusaders for the city and carry the city on our shoulders and our backs. And that's a spirit, an attitude, and an energy that is a positive thing. And that's the story I want to tell about Detroit. You know, my husband's from Southfield, and he's a hip-hop artist. And in hip-hop, it is very territorial. You know, it is very much about representing the struggle. And it's assumed that people that grew up outside of Detroit or in its surrounding suburbs are not a part of the struggle of the city. But what I think we sort of get lost in these narratives about the suburbs versus the city is that there's this feeling of flight that's happened. It started with white flight, and then it happened with black flight, right? So that people were getting further and further away, running away from the city. But I don't think that that's an accurate narrative. I think people that grew up in surrounding suburbs in Detroit still very much represent Detroit wherever they go. Not just because that's the most probably common denominator when people aren't from Michigan. They don't, you know, Detroit is the marker for them. But I think it's also because people spend time in the city, they spend their money in the city. But there's the infectious spirit, the arts culture in the city that everybody wants to engage and participate in. There's the music culture that Detroit has one of the most advanced and amazing music cultures post Motown, and arts cultures, poetry communities that I think that everybody has a stake in that. And we get very territorial because we feel that the city sort of has been abandoned by people wanting to disassociate themselves with Detroit. And so then it feels a little conflicting when people decide to reassociate themselves with the city, because it feels like, well, you weren't here through our tough times, so why do you want to be here now? And I think that divide happens from a lack of understanding and a lack of healing from a lot of different sources, and racism and police brutality and government corruption are all a part of that narrative. But I think that when people get a chance to really explore that culture and really explore the history of how Detroit became divided, I think that that's a jump off point for the healing to begin, and a bridging of communities rather than a separation.
I came here in 1980, which was after all the buildings were built the way they are now. The school has been open since '38, And it's more difficult to keep a school now, but we feel it's important. At the time that I came to DeSales in '66, the neighborhood was just beginning to change from white to black. And that's been going on ever since, fairly rapidly. And so I have been involved right since the beginning with neighborhood organization, with interracial discussion and encounter with one another. These kinds of projects have been part of my priesthood ever since I was ordained. And so appealing to the African American community, because the Catholic Church pretty much has a reputation as a white church. So that's a problem that we simply have to keep working at. But that means the way I preach, the music, everything has to somehow be community oriented. Recently there was a guy, and when somebody comes and is dumping trash on an empty lot, he comes with his camera and puts it on YouTube. And he tells them, you're going to be on YouTube in about an hour. Well, they don't want, and the guy, of course, he focuses in on the license plate, and so people will usually they'll skedaddle. If he finds that they've dumped it when he wasn't there, he'll go rummaging through and find the address of where it came from, put it in his truck, and then take it and dump it back in their front yard. He calls that return to sender. Well, that kind of gritty dedication to the community is it's pretty much homespun, but that kind of vitality is important.
When Mary was 2 years old, her family moved to a large colonial home on Pearson Avenue between 6 Mile Road and 7 Mile Road on Detroit's northwest side. The neighborhood was predominantly white. The only African Americans Mary saw on a daily basis were her family's maids and the men who picked up the garbage. Her mother, Joan, employed maids to help with her growing family. Hattie came a few days a week, and Marie, one of the neighbors' maids, also helped out. Clarence mowed the grass, trimmed the bushes, and tended the garden. Mary knew little of their lives, except that Clarence had a daughter named Avon, after the Avon lady. Mary's mother, Joan, was an advocate for racial equality. She boycotted the parish picnics held in Dearborn, Michigan, because Dearborn was known to be unfriendly toward African Americans. About one African American family in the parish, she would say, "Well, they aren't invited to the picnics, neither are we." Unfortunately, she was often alone in her boycotts. She never boycotted the parish or joined a larger movement that supported her politics. Her brand of protest was a form of yoo-hooing that someone had been forgotten. There was a cop on Mary's block, the bad kind of cop, the kind you don't want to pull you over late at night for something you didn't do, who was a renowned racist. He slicked his hair back with grease, he wore boots that clicked as he walked, and he didn't smile. It was rumored that he kicked over an injured African-American man on a stretcher, causing him to be paralyzed. His wife later committed suicide, also rumored that she was a victim of domestic abuse. One day, a babysitter dared Mary to jump in front of his car and stick out her tongue at him. Believing that racists were bad people, Mary accepted the challenge. She hopped in front of his car, her little 7-year-old legs planted firmly hip-width apart. She faced him square on as he was about to drive out of his driveway and stuck out her tongue, waggling her fingers at the side of her face. She repeated this act several times in the next few weeks, each time more expressive, more purposeful. After a week of taunting him, he drove out of the driveway and then stopped his car and rolled down the window. "Little girl, Lord is going to come down and cut off your tongue." She smirked at him. She didn't reply, but thought, "I don't think so."
I remember my parents never said anything negative about white people. Never. Never said anything negative about white people. They didn't talk about white people as a group. None of that. Now, I do remember my parents going to events like when Dr. King, MLK, came to Detroit. They actually went to that event and they marched in that march down Woodward. In fact, we just had the 50th anniversary of that. And so I know that that's something that my parents participated in. But and I know that they had strong feelings about civil rights and equality, but they didn't necessarily group people together. So my peers and I, because I know his other parents did that also, my peers and I had to develop a skill to be able to interact with people from different cultures.
I was looking for a home. I'm just going to fast forward to when I stumbled upon this one, which I almost missed. I almost missed this home because it was mislisted. It was listed as a much smaller home than it is, with fewer bedrooms and fewer bathrooms, and it wasn't what I was looking for, but something said, just go and look at the property, Stephanie. So, came out, rolled up on this house, and I thought, my gosh, this is amazing. Pulled up in the driveway, came into the backyard. It was like a forest, and I was intimidated for the first time in my house hunt. The yard was really, really big, but it was quite overgrown as well, and I wasn't sure how we were going to clear this space for anything. But at the same time, I started to think about all of the possibilities that this house and this property offered. My thought was a garden that would bring people together and teach young people a life skill. The vision for Full Harvest was to get people a little bit more closely connected with food, to demonstrate how easy it is to grow food, how wonderful it tastes when it's fresh and coming from the garden, how easy it is to prepare it, because one of the challenges I think with gardening is not only the labor involved and the intimidation that comes with gardening. Will I be able to grow the food? Will I be able to keep the plants from dying? But one of the challenges is not knowing how to prepare food fresh. When I talk to some of the people who come over and they see the herbs in the garden, they're amazed. They aren't used to seeing herbs that are fresh because they're used to buying them dried and chopped and in the little cans. And in essence, I think that the herbs taste a lot better when they're fresh, but they also have a lot of really cool medicinal properties that, we get to talk about some of the different ways that rosemary works and that thyme works, and they're really, really good in roast and really, really good in chicken. When the class came over the other day, the cool thing is they tasted a lot of the things in the garden, cucumbers, zucchini flowers, tomatoes, and the kids were really, really engaged because it's right out here. It's fresh and it's fun, and of course they're surrounded by other kids. So it's also a cool way to get kids involved and to get them involved in eating vegetables and trying herbs and wanting to grow at home.
I worked for a utilities company, Detroit Edison, and someone had reported that they were stealing electricity out of the house. And when I went to investigate to see if the electricity was being stolen, I discovered the house was empty. And no one was stealing, but they had their security lights on. And so we started to check to see who owned the house. Found out that the realtor had it and it was for sale. It was a good time. The one thing we did when we got there, we made sure we knew our neighbors. I would walk up and down the block, it's a very long block. I would introduce myself, and we just started communicating with each other. So we formed the block association or block club, and that brought us even closer together, working on different issues, and the children all played with each other. We started a Bible study and a little church there in the house.
This particular site was started in 2007. I used to live in the mansion next door to this church, and I saw that this church had a lot of social justice programs going on, and my kitchen window faced their parking lot, and I noticed how old the congregation was, and I'm like, how are these old people doing this? And I'm like, what's going to happen when they're not around anymore? And I thought, oh, yeah, then it'll be my turn. So I started to get involved in the church, and long time ago, around 1987, my old hippie friends built this playscape in the playground right here, and they didn't have any kids to test it, and at the time I had 2 small kids, so they called me up and they're like, Kate, come over, bring your kids over, test out the playscape. So my kids fell in love with it, so I used to sit over there and do my homework from Wayne State, and I'd look at these empty fields and the grass would be real high and it would look like a prairie, and I'd say, that should be a community garden. And then almost 20 years to the day, I started this garden. When the new pastor came, I think he came in 2002. Yeah, he came in 2002. He was really young, and he liked what I was doing at the house next door. I had a nice garden, and I had a fire pit, and I used to cook on it all the time. And so me and him started to communicate, and I'd say to him, that should be a community garden. And he said, well, when you do it, it will be. And I was like, oh no, I'm too busy for that. That'll never happen. But then in 2005, I went down to New Orleans to help after Katrina. And I got down there so early, I wound up being one of the first responders. My idea was I would go down and help first responders because I used to be a chef, so I know how to cook. And I'm a massage therapist, so I thought I would relieve tension and give guys massages and all that. When I got down there, it was such a mess and so much devastation that I was actually one of the first responders and helping people. And then I wound up cooking for 3 weeks, 21 days at a special needs shelter in Covington, Louisiana. And then after 2 years of me and my friends going down to New Orleans, we looked at we kept taking pictures and putting them side by side, New Orleans, Detroit, and people could not tell which were which. And we already kind of knew that. And one day we looked at one another, there were 4 of us, and we were like, I love coming down here and everything, but we used to be active in our own community. Let's go home and do something. So I called up the pastor and I had a meeting with him, and I said, I'm ready to do a community garden. I need your blessing. And he's like, yeah, you can have my blessing, but the church is poor. We don't have no money for you. I'm like, that's okay. I'll just do it.
So how'd you do it?
So with $10 and a shovel.
Seriously?
$10 and a shovel. I came out here, and at the time, all over there used to be houses and apartment buildings. And they had been abandoned for a long time, but people lived in them. They were squatters. And I didn't realize they were all squatters until there was going to be a CVS right there, and they tore down all those buildings. But before then, those people were my neighbors who lived over there. And I saw them walk into the party store all the time, and I was really broke when I lived next door, and I said, we really need better food in this community. And so with $10 and a shovel, I started building the beds, because I did a soil test and I found out that I have high levels of lead in the soil here, so I build up above the soil line where the roots would tap in, and I bring in a bunch of organic material which helps sequester heavy metals in the ground so that it blocks the bioavailability of the plant uptake. So I started building raised beds. Well, each one of these raised beds costs $50.
Okay. Now, do you test that soil to make sure it doesn't have lead in it, or how?
I buy that soil and make that soil, so no, it has no lead in it. Okay. Like $50 for that little bit of thing. I said, oh man, I got to come up with a better idea. So that's when I came up with the spiral with the tires. Me and my friend were driving around in the wintertime, and we were collecting these tires. So one day, she ran into this guy who was illegally dumping tires, and she jumps out of the truck and she says, hey, what are you doing? You're illegally dumping. You can't do that. I could call the police on you now. And she pulls out the phone. She goes, but I got a better idea for you. You load up these trucks, these tires, and you take them to Martin Luther King and Trumbull, and there's a lot there. You'll see some tires. Dump them there. And I showed up one day, and there were all the tires I needed to build the raised beds. We've all been really broke here in Detroit for a really long time. I know people who have been living in their houses for generations and for like 10, 15 years haven't had heat or electricity. So if I can teach somebody how to make a rocket stove and stay warm, then I like that. I like to be able to do that.
Detroit, I went to Wayne State University, got my bachelor's and master's in economics from Wayne. And I worked in the auto industry going through college like everybody else has in the city. Got my degree, and I finally went off and worked in the city of Detroit in more or less economic development. And at the time, when Coleman Young was the mayor. And so I kind of learned about economic development because I had taken economics, and I learned about the dynamics of cities. That fascinated me in economics, was that you could apply economics to cities and understand cities, through its changes and through its economic structure and through its manufacturing base and through the changes that cities go under, not just understand it from the headlines in the Detroit Free Press or Channel 7 News. And it's more than just having a silly city council or a bad mayor. It's really a long, there's a long stream of things that go on in cities that make cities what they are and what they will be. If you look at a lot of what Detroit was this magnificent machine that made things, right? And they made, the manufacturing was a big deal. So if you can look at the city of Detroit through, for instance, the eyes of the Conner Corridor. Conner Corridor was this corridor that came from the Detroit River up Conner, kind of went through the middle of the city. And so along that Conner Corridor was a rail line connected it. So there was a power plant that serviced that corridor. There was the rail line that connected all the plants, and in that area there were several factories, right? There was a Chrysler factory. It was Chalmers, then it became Chrysler, built in 1914, right? And it became Chrysler. They employed like 20,000 people when they were going. You could go up the corridor and you could see the Hudson's Motor Car Company. You could see, Cadillac had a plant there. I mean, you could probably say there were 200,000 people employed in this very concentrated area. Well, guess what? They all closed up.
In late February 1968, Mary was playing in the front yard. The day was unseasonably warm, so the kids were enjoying the warm weather outside. Tammy, her lively, untamed terrier, who was prone to escaping, frolicked out back with her younger brother. When Mary's mother interrupted her play to ask that she watch her younger brother, she resentfully opened the gate with little regard for the direction that she opened it. Tammy couldn't escape if she had the gate in, but she opened the gate outward and almost immediately realized her mistake. Tammy rushed for the exit, and her skinny little 7-year-old legs tried to block her, but she slithered between. She tried to squeeze them in an attempt to hold Tammy in, and Tammy slipped through the small opening and her furry body was running free. She began making a great circle, picking up speed as she darted between the trees. Mary trailed behind her, chasing her through several neighbors' yards. Occasionally, she'd run toward Mary when Mary called her name, but just as Mary bent down to grab her collar, Tammy would dash off again. Tammy ran zigzags, celebrating her freedom, circling Mary, and then took off toward Pickford, a busy street that Mary was not allowed to cross on her own. People got killed on busy neighborhood streets. 6-mile and 7-mile roads were notoriously busy and never meant to be crossed without a light. Grand River Avenue was the worst. Every year, some child dashed to their death on the 4-lane road without a light. Pickford was not as busy as those roads, but it did not have a light, and cars sped down faster than the 35-mile-per-hour speed limit. One had to be at least 9 or 10 to cross Pickford alone. Mary left her brother behind in the backyard with the gate closed. She ran behind Tammy down Pearson toward Pickford, desperately calling out Tammy's name, pleading for her to come back. She dashed across Pickford, unharmed. Mary motioned to an older girl to help her catch her dog. The girl made a few friendly, but ineffectual gestures to befriend her and grab her leash, but Tammy scooted away and the girl walked away. Mary knew she had to use her wit and change strategies. She quickly remembered that Tammy loved her pink, fluffy mittens, which she had in her pocket. She waved them in the air, calling her name, and Tammy looked at Mary. The mittens had caught her attention. For a brief moment, Mary felt relieved and excited that Tammy would return. Tammy happily started to race across the street, and suddenly, a white car with a black hood hit her. Mary heard a thud. Her once lively dog laid flat and still in the middle of the road. The car drove over her body and sped away. Mary was still unable to cross the street or move. She just stared in disbelief at Tammy's still little body in the road. Finally, passengers in another car stopped to pick Tammy up so that no more cars would hit her and damage her body. They placed her at the side of the road like roadkill. Distressed and crying, Mary ran back to tell the others the tragic news. Mary kept saying, "Tammy is dead," over and over. Her siblings were all crying, and her mom went down to gather her in a blanket and bring her body home. No one directly blamed Mary, but no one consoled her either. If you were to ask any of Mary's older siblings today how Tammy died, they might start the story with Mary opening the gate the wrong way. There would not be a mention of why a 7-year-old who couldn't even cross the streets by herself was in charge of watching her 4-year-old brother, or why the dog was not trained, or why the girl from the block across Pickford only went through the motions of helping, or why the car sped away that had hit and run. Mary always remembered opening the gate wrong and failed in her responsibility to protect the family pet. As Mary grew older, every time she walked past the same street corner on Pickford, her mind would flash back to a sound of a thud and Tammy's still body laying there.
The folks in the banking industry and the real estate industry wanted to get the whites out of their homes. I knew that. So we've all heard stories about blockbusting, where they would hire a pregnant black woman to push a baby stroller up and down the street, and then the phone calls, the telemarketing would begin, where they would call all the white families and say, "Did you see that? They're coming. Your property values are going to go down. You're going to have to put bars on your windows."
It was a mixed neighborhood. There was white, black, in the neighborhood. And one of my best friends, I can't think of the kid's name now, but it was a young man about my same age, and who lived next door. And and he was my first friend in the new neighborhood. And so it was just playtime. The transition was just, I was a little kid in this neighborhood, and there was my friend next door that we could interact with, but it didn't last long because his parent moved. And so the neighborhood became increasingly Africanized, if you will.
Coleman Young was elected in 1973, the first black mayor of Detroit, and the last real mayor we've had. Before that, there was a lot of racial tension, which we recall from the riots and the various attempts at quashing that. And when Coleman Young was elected, there was incredible white flight and divestment from Detroit, and we lived basically under an economic blockade for 20 years. Everybody who could leave did, and there wasn't a single, not one house built during that time, not a single unit dwelling built during that time. There were apartment buildings and senior buildings. Not one house was built during that time. And so he ruled in Detroit for 20 years. A most beloved mayor, of course, depending on who you ask. But when he died, and he warned us of what was to come, he did. But when he died, and his hearse was heading down Woodward Avenue, and I was picking up my kids on their after school, and I was stuck in traffic. It turned out that the traffic was the funeral procession from Coleman. And the people on the streets, a lot of people on the streets, right here at Woodward and Lothrop, they just stopped and raised their fist, head down, and bowed until the hearse was passed. And all the people sitting in traffic, and I was sitting, on Woodward, tied up in traffic, and I looked and everyone was weeping. All the people in the cars were weeping. All the people standing up, just weeping. Because we knew that what went with Coleman was a life that we would really have to defend. Detroit is really a place of deep resistance. And the reason, historically, this is a place where everybody could come here and work. And if you didn't work, you didn't come here. If you weren't a worker, and if you were afraid, you didn't come here. This is our gene pool. Everybody came from somewhere. I've spent my life listening to stories from people. I've spent my life getting people's stories. And Detroit is such a place filled with people who left the South, people who left other countries, people who left Mexico like my family did, and came here to work in auto. And they came on their own steam, and they left home, they left loved ones, and got a job in these factories to be able to make a good living for themselves and their families. And I'm a product of that. My grandfather and father are both Chrysler retirees. We came from UAW. We have no other history in this country but auto. Detroit, UAW. We have no other history. That's our entire existence, our entire identity is tied up with you work hard, don't do more than you're supposed to do, because you do not own the plant. Put your kids through school, get a car, live a good life. You don't hurt anybody and you don't let anybody hurt you. The thing about white people, and I've seen this growing up in Detroit all my life, is that white people will not coexist. When the area becomes integrated to a certain level, either they leave or you leave. You know that racism is its own thing. It has no reason, it has no logic, and it trumps economics, it trumps everything. So people left beautiful neighborhoods to go to shit neighborhoods that were like these prefab, they might as well have been, double wides, and made lives there, waiting, and are now here to reclaim these mansions. But they need the parts to fix them up.
Oh, a lot of Detroiters, I think the fight of music is hard enough. I mean, when you're a musician or an artist, it's a struggle to have, especially now with all the competition, so many bands, everything, internet, Facebook. But back then, we were kind of like rebels and underdogs, and some of the spirit of Detroit seems to be that way, that, things go against the city, and I've seen that so long, and I think it's put into music somehow. I could speak a little bit better about it if I had more, but it's like almost, it's a struggle. It's not New York, it's not LA, and it wasn't built like Chicago or New York. It was spread out, and you've got all these different mixes of people, okay? And the thing about back when I was growing up, the neighborhood, again, like I explained, was pretty diverse. It became, I think, in the 70s as we moved out, white people were moving out. All right, but I think with the music, with me coming back, I wanted to be in Detroit. My parents instilled this real love of the city, and they were even bummed. They wanted, they were kind of like, oh, God, it was so, we all really liked the city, and that's just the way it was for us. So my identity as a Detroit musician kind of meant, at a young age, that I wanted to come back. So I sort of see a lot of Detroiters now, even, it's not so bad. Well, it is kind of, though. It's a tough struggle. It's sort of, I use it as the underdog mentality of how people are always pushed down. Even though Detroit's a great music city, the local musicians trying to, they've had to leave to do things. Go to Europe, they get a lot of notice. It's kind of hard. There's some anomalies, I have friends that have done really well, but it's a tough city to get over in.
Most of the Catholic children attended the local Catholic school, Christ the King, which Mary attended until 7th grade. When she was in 6th grade, Mary saw a mass exodus of students since Catholic schools were no longer exempt from paying property taxes. Tuition skyrocketed, and almost a third of her class transferred to the public schools. Catholic schools were known for covering the basics and having discipline. They were a homogeneous group of students. Most of them were white and from 2-parent households. They wore the school uniforms, did their homework, and played organized sports. During this time, Catholic nuns were beginning to find their voice within the church, and some of those progressive nuns taught at Christ the King. In 5th grade, Sister Kathleen gave Mary a poor conduct grade on one occasion. Mary was shocked. Mary may have been a little chatty at times, but she was always respectful to her teachers, and she never disturbed the class. She told Mary that it had to do with a classmate being bullied. Mary protested, saying that she'd never bullied anyone, and Sister Kathleen agreed with her. "But," she said, "you also didn't defend her, and I expected that of you." When her days at Christ the King came to an end, Mary and her brothers and sisters were enrolled in the Holcomb School. The quality of the education was poor. Some kids were still trying to learn basic multiplication in 7th grade. Several kids in her grade were 3 or 4 grade levels behind. 16 and 17-year-olds sat in her 7th grade class. She was picked on as the new kid on the first day. She sat in front of a student who'd been kicked out of Christ the King for smoking a cigarette in 4th grade. When another student asked the boy behind her who she was, Mary was about to answer when he interrupted and said, "Some big zero from Christ the King." That was her introduction to public school. Mr. Casemore was her science teacher. He never taught, only asked the students to copy the text in their science books into their notebooks while he read a book. If he thought anyone was disturbing his quiet reading time, he wrote their names down on a list. Those kids were then sent to their homeroom and spanked with wooden paddles. Paddles made by shop class students. Let's say that again. Children were hit, or spanked, to use the term of the day, but really beaten by the wooden paddles they made themselves. Mr. Casemore disliked Mary's younger brother, who often spoke about the teacher's laziness. Because of that association, Mary's name was placed on the list and she was sent to homeroom. Mr. Casemore expected her homeroom teacher, Mr. Hanson, to deliver the blows, but Mr. Hanson was one of the few teachers who really tried to teach. He came from an old-fashioned belief of spare the rod, spoil the child. When Mary showed up in the homeroom, he expressed surprise at seeing her name on the list, and she assured him of her innocence. Much to her surprise, the 2 kids who had called her a big zero came to her defense. They admitted their own poor conduct, but assured Mr. Hanson that she'd done nothing wrong. Mary was spared the paddle. It was common for the teenagers in her class, who'd not yet passed 7th grade, to force the younger children to fight one another for their entertainment. Everybody would watch. One day, Mary's younger brother, Ed, and his best friend were intimidated into fighting each other. Mary walked right into the center of the crowd, picked them both up by the collars of their shirts, and marched them out of the circle. The older boys chuckled, and the crowd jeered as she walked them out. Annie, a girl from a troubled family, seized the moment and declared that she was going to fight Mary for breaking up the fight. But Mary kept walking toward home, with Ed in front of her and Brad, his friend, hanging behind with her younger brother Joe. Joe watched Brad and Ed being forced to fight and didn't come to his brother's aid. He thought it best for Ed to learn to fight. Joe would fight to the bitter end and earned a lot of street respect. Bullies learned to stay away from him. He also knew not to stop Mary in her attempts to break up the fight. Her best friend Michelle kept looking back and reporting on Annie's position. Mary knew that if push came to shove, she could push and shove harder. They made it home safely.
What I loved about my street on Curtis is I had the most beautiful trees. They were so big and beautiful, and they were like this, all on the whole street, and the whole neighborhood was nice.
Cool,
it was a cool,
beautiful neighborhood. Not now.
Not now. Yeah.
Now you go back and you're like,
it's a war zone. It's a war zone.
I was jumped by 11 people
two guys and 9 girls, and I was getting my butt kicked, and the principal, I think, or one of the counselors was driving by and stopped his car, and they all just fled at that point. But when I finally got up, I looked up and I looked at one of the neighbors' house, and she was standing there watching this whole thing. I was like, talk about not wanting to get involved. And then she was like, oh, honey, I didn't know it was you. It's like, it doesn't matter who it was. You know, people just didn't want to get involved. And
a lot of memories. I'll never, can't exchange memories. And I love Detroit. And my sons love Detroit too. I have a rapper, Joe Kane from Detroit. And I also have a son, John Perry. He went to Wayne State, and he still lives down by Wayne State because he loves Detroit. He loves the culture. So it's a Detroit thing. And I just proud to be a memory of it. And we still go back, go Lions, go Tigers, and go Red Wings. We love it. We go all the time.
We were going to school with people we knew. There was not a lot of just indiscriminate violence. We knew each other. There were fights. There were the greasers and the the potheads, and there were athletes, and then the French club people. There were always different types of people. But I wouldn't beat up somebody in the French club just because I was in the ski club. I mean, it just never did occur to me. So after they mixed us all up, and that lack of trust, because people that we knew or didn't know, or where they were coming from, I guess they were maybe the kids were testing the limits. I don't know, but then you get more incidences of there's a knife in school. There's it's scary. You're scared. It's more like it was. These were things we weren't even thinking about before.
Catholic Central High School was an all-boys Catholic high school in Detroit. It was almost all white. There was about 400 students in the school, and there was 8 black kids in the school. At the most, at any one point in time, there was 8 of us. There was 4 black kids in my class. We moved between 3 and 4, and so there was not much culturally for African Americans at the school. The black kids at the school actually at one point tried to start a club, and we were not allowed to start a club because it would be a club that didn't allow most of the other students to join, and all clubs had to be inclusive of all the students. So we just started a club and all the black kids joined it.
Mary attended Emerson Junior High School for 8th grade, which had a better reputation than Hokum. While Hokum reflected the neighborhood it served, white and working class, Emerson served a wider range of neighborhoods, and the demographics of the city were changing rapidly. Emerson was an integrated junior high. Her first week at Emerson, Mary's gym class played volleyball, a sport that Mary was not particularly good at, and as it turns out, neither was anyone on her team. A few girls fumbled their attempts to bump and set, while one, an African-American girl named Myrna, missed the ball entirely. In her frustration, she shoved Mary from behind. Confused, Mary turned around to see why she was upset. "Stupid white girl, why'd you make me miss that ball?" Myrna's friends began to giggle, and she got pumped up by their giggles. Mary was so shocked she didn't know what to say. Myrna was starting to want to fight and closed in on her. Mary backed away as Mary wanted no part of a fight. Mary wanted to show that she was a nice white person. Why, her parents had voted for McGovern for president. Mary knew this would not improve the situation, so she apologized for being white, for missing the ball, and Myrna gave Mary one more shove to settle the score. During this time, Mary's mother returned to work, which distinguished her from most women in the neighborhood. Few worked outside the home. She was also one of the few women in the neighborhood who was college educated. Her mom loved her work, but she was ashamed of being a working mother. Her parents were also trying to survive. They knew that her sisters and she were smart and capable of catching up on homework assignments if they missed school, so a system was devised in which her sisters and she missed every fourth day to babysit their younger siblings while her parents worked. The school never acknowledged the absences. Despite missing a lot of school, they were still expected to achieve good grades. Mary's history teacher, Mr. Williams, had an unusual method of teaching and maintaining discipline. He'd set up scenarios with the goal of learning to beat the system. He'd instruct the students to skip lunch and randomly deny them bathroom passes in order to experience the daily injustices that were part of some people's lives. He repeatedly told his students, "Don't be expecting much. You're the best of a crummy lot." On one occasion, Mr. Williams gave Mary a lower grade. He seemed to think giving her a low grade in conduct was funny. When she protested and informed him that her parents would not find a low grade amusing, he admitted that she did not deserve the grade. But, he pointed out, like anyone, she could be wrongfully accused of something she didn't do, and this was a more important lesson to learn. He didn't change the grade, and to her surprise, her parents were too busy making ends meet to notice.
What's important to understand is who took our city. And that is really what is rarely ever talked about. The banks and the nonprofits, which are like the banks in drag, have taken over our city. And the bankruptcy law firms are just having an orgy at the trough as we speak. And they're closing schools with false reports of what's wrong with them. What it is real estate. The people are not wanted, but their buildings and their schools are.
Detroit punk was like a movement of like-minded people who wanted to come out and tell their story. And whatever they were going to do, there was artists, there was musicians, there were people just, it was a scene, you know, a party. Let's go here, let's play in a basement, let's have a bunch of people come. It started like that. I mean, some of these musicians are great. They really were. And other people just were learning, you know. There was always those band, you know, and we were all kind of learning together. I mean, we all wanted to make music. So rather than, okay, we don't have a record deal, you know, we've got to create ourselves and make our own scene and find places to record. So punk to me was that. It was just coming out and making yourself heard, making a statement with your music and your energy. And even if it wasn't attacking and passion that way, it was creating. It was just coming out instead of being, oh, you can't do that, you don't have enough money. Oh, I'm going to do it anyway.
We went to an international women's conference in South Africa, and I noticed something different about the people of South Africa and how they were healing after the end of apartheid. Apartheid ended, and they had reconciliation councils or committees around the country where people would come and talk about their actions, what they did, and it was painful. When I first heard about it, I didn't think it would work. I thought the folks were nuts. But I saw, you know, Bishop Tutu over there. He was actually put on the council that went around and did this. And so I just noticed when I went there for the conference that the people were healing. Whenever we went on a historical tour, if a white person was conducting the tour and they were telling the story of the country, they included everyone in their story. They didn't leave out half of the people. They talked about their actions and some bad stuff happened. They talked about the other side, the opposition and those actions, and then there was some sort of a coming together. When we went to the prison where Nelson Mandela served time, we had one of the docents gave us a tour. That gentleman was of African descent. He was black African. He told another story, and he made sure he included everyone in the story. Everyone over there does this. You come back to the United States, we don't do that. We only tell one side of the story. We don't include the other half. It's like leaving out one half of the family. And so that's really a big thing that I noticed. They're healing faster than we're still healing from the 1876 or Reconstruction. The people in South Africa are healing faster.
Detroit can be a great city. When I grew up, it was safe. It was a place to be. We used to be able to go out, be out all day, and nobody worried about us. We never worried about anything except maybe we would get into trouble doing something our parents would be upset about. I want the children in Detroit today to be able to experience the same thing. And I want them to be able to do that without fear. I don't want them to be able to have to fear being shot as they play in their neighborhood. I want them to be comfortable in the city and be proud.
When you don't have any hope, and that's pretty much it. The game is over. Even a rabbit, if you get them in the corner and they don't see any way out, then they're going to transform into this totally other creature. You know, it's not going to be the Easter Bunny anymore. He is going to be a vicious animal, you know, out of desperation. And so that's what the city is, you know. It's like a desperate situation. I mean, it's clawing and it's biting and it's destructive. And until we can tame the beast, then things will start getting back to normal.
Detroit has to become a city that is safe, that people can feel they can go down there and not feel like they're in danger. They have to bring back community to downtown Detroit. They have to bring people back to the city that want to live there and want to do business there. And until that happens, I don't think Detroit can thrive.
I'm getting ready to move back into the city of Detroit. Simple because we have property, family property that's viable and vibrant, and so we're going to fix it up. And we're all looking for this renaissance that's being promised, and you see bits and pieces, but until there's a larger conversation in this geographic area about stratification, until we have a larger conversation about race, as well as having a larger conversation of what we want the state to be and what we want the state to represent, as well as really looking at how Detroit specifically has been portrayed, and as we were saying, the behavioral sciences, what is that really about? And so it's about empowering people to have better conversations about their way forward and building community, the way we imagine that everyone is viable, everyone's appreciated, everyone's respected, everyone has the opportunity to be all that they really can be. And it's just really not a cliche. When we look around us as to the communities, places like Seattle, even Portland, Oregon, what did they do? And so the communities all decided to embrace themselves, build the appropriate infrastructure, things like transportation. People need to get around, using space smartly, being able to really look at the educational process, for the state, for the local community. But there seems to be this battle that does not serve the African American community, and long term really won't serve anyone else.
Mary's family sold their large brick 5-bedroom home in Detroit for $35,000, at a time when the equivalent home sold for over $200,000 in the suburbs. They ended up in a 150-year-old farmhouse on 11 Mile Road in suburban Farmington Hills. This was a step down for housing, but a step up for education. The school was superb, and the teachers par excellence. She was thrilled to be able to learn. Mr. Williams was wrong. The students weren't the best out of a cruddy lot in Detroit. The schools were. Mary was amazed how much easier it was to excel in the schools in the suburbs, where there were resources, planned instruction, and an agenda that included learning. The students were polite, almost too polite, and they looked rich. She remembered thinking, my God, they even look rich in jeans. Her family's suburban church, Our Lady of Sorrows, had its own Diego Rivera mural behind the altar. Imagine that. A parish so rich it had its own private Rivera mural. Well, it wasn't all paradise. Our Lady of Sorrows also had a pedophile priest, and there were a few serial killers on the loose in Oakland County. When, in Mary's comparative literature class, they read Cry, My Beloved Country, a story set in South Africa, she had the aha moment. She realized that she lived in apartheid. The overwhelmingly Caucasian high school had a talent show. 5 acts featured students who blackfaced themselves. One act was Al Jolson. A few other acts tried to pay tribute to the African American soul contribution. A few jocks that put on some of the acts actually had rhythm and could dance, but still put on blackface. And no one spoke up. The show went on. Mary was in disbelief and felt very alone.
I mean, everybody knew about Joe Louis. You know, when I was coming up, they talked about Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, heavyweight champion. Detroit is kind of like, it's known as a tough town to live in. And he kind of represents that, because he grew up in the streets, and I'm sure he had his share of fights. And so I think that's one of the things that he would represent. If anybody knows about the Big Fist downtown, he represents that tough spirit, to come back. In some ways, that's kind of Detroit. To come back, you can be knocked down, but you can still come back.
I think one of the fun things about being a literary artist in Detroit or a musical performer is though everything can vanish, Detroit holds on to the ghosts of its previous successes. And so in this neighborhood, which is one of my favorite neighborhoods to write about and wander about, we have on Orleans Street here where John Lee Hooker lived, and he lived right back there where the church is. The neighborhood's gone, but John Lee is not gone at all. And then over around the corner we have the Brewster Projects where Diana Ross and her cohorts lived. So the beauty of that for me is when I'm in this neighborhood, I feel them here, because our legacy does not leave. It's a voice and a song that lingers. So I love this neighborhood, and it never ceases to give me inspiration.
It's more like an arranged marriage. It's almost like our ancestors arranged this, and here we are, and we're in this marriage, and we can't get a divorce. If we get a divorce, it's going to destroy the human family. So we have to make this work.
My hope is that the people don't give up.
If we don't get to the core of these things, where social unrest begins, I think is the seed of it, is an important thing to examine so that we know how to move forward and heal some of these things that we haven't gotten right over the decades.
Tough luck.